What's up guys, Grandmaster Igor Smirnov is here, and in this video you're about to see one of the greatest examples of attack from the World Champ Magnus Carlsen. He's playing white and he starts with pawn to e4. And he's playing against Vladimir Potkin, who is a coach of Sergey Karjakin, therefore it's a very interesting clash. Potkin also was a European champion, therefore he is a really strong grandmaster, and therefore it's even more interesting to see how Carlsen managed to totally destroy his castling and create this devastating attack seemingly out of a pretty standard position. So the first moves are quite standard, just Sicilian defense, therefore I don't comment on it that much. Both players simply develop their pieces, a6, prophylaxis against potential knight b5, white does the same, a3, preventing black bishop to go to b4, black goes knight f6, and here Carlsen plays f4. The first little bit of an attacking move, not really an attack yet, but anyway, he's already threatening, pushing the pawn forward, which would disturb the black's knight from f6. Interestingly enough, black didn't simply prevent white from playing e5, which he could do by playing pawn to d6. Instead, he wanted to do something active as well. Therefore, first of all, he took that knight on d4, and after white recapture, black played knight to g4, which already causes a little bit of problems for white, as you may see, because the bishop is attacked, and it can't go back like that easily because it also has to protect that pawn on f4, which is somewhat controlled by the black's queen. And that's the first typical pattern. Usually, a lot of players, when their piece is attacked, they just think how to retreat, how to defend it. But notice that notice that Carlsen, in this case, thinks about counterattack. He plays queen to b6. You may wonder that it's not really such an attack, it's just an offer of an exchange of queens. But nevertheless, the pattern is white is going forward. He doesn't want to go back, to retreat. And that is the very important thing to remember. Whenever you can counterattack, it's usually the best thing to do. If black would just trade off the queens, that would also help white to place his bishop to a very active square forward into b6, which would also somewhat lock the black's pieces on the queen side. And everyone knows that Carlsen is a brilliant endgame player, therefore Potkin was not very enthusiastic about this idea, and instead he played bishop to d6. And it's actually another cool idea. As you can see, instead of just trading off the pieces, which is the thing that most players do automatically, Potkin tries to keep up the pressure. And that's a very important rule in chess. If you ever watched my other videos in the past, you may know this rule to take as a mistake. And it's a great rule to remember because it applies to a huge variety of positions. Instead of taking opponent's piece, or in other words, instead of exchanging the piece, try to keep up the pressure. Force your opponent to take, because in this case, you usually get into a similar kind of position, but in the more favorable variation of it. Just like in this position, if black would just grab the queen on b6, it would help white's bishop to go forward. Instead, black wants to develop his bishop, and now offers white to trade off the queens. Carlsen follows the same trick, and he plays pawn to e5. He also does not want to back down, he just wants to keep attacking and keep increasing the pressure. Finally, black decided to start trading off something. He took the bishop, white recaptured, black played bishop to e7. It may seem like it was more active for black to put the bishop to c5, but it doesn't change that much, because in that case the white's queen would go to g3. Let me go to that variation instead. So let's say black would play bishop to c5. The white's queen would go to g3, attacking that pawn on g7, and therefore this move bishop c5 does not really win a tempo for black. It would lead to similar variations anyway. In the actual game, black instead played bishop to e7, white castled queenside, black played pawn to b5, preparing development of his bishop and also possibly the b4 push in the future to start some attack on the queen side. White played knight e4. A very cool square for the knight. The knight is centralized. He's also controlling this weak square d6, and he's ready to go there. Black castled. White played bishop d3. Even though it may seem like it's a little bit too late to really start doing something active for black, but in reality he could have actually first maybe finalized the development of his queenside pieces, because after he just castled kingside, it made it simpler for white to take aim at the black's king there, which white did by playing bishop to d3. And that's also a very powerful attacking piece, because that bishop on d3 takes aim at the pawn on h7, and therefore it can be one of the primary pieces in the white's future attack. The d3 square is usually available for the white's bishop in almost any kind of openings, and therefore it's one of the little but useful patterns to remember. Black played bishop b7, and there we go. Here there was the first example where Carlsen really rushed into the straightforward attack. Can you see the way for white to do it? So, let me know in the comments below, just write it down there. Of course, I don't say that currently white has a winning continuation, it's still too early to say this, but he has a way to start a very interesting attack, which he did by playing knight to f6. And here the point is pretty simple. White wants to destroy the cover around the black's king, because it would allow white to unleash the very straightforward attack against this king on g8. And in this position, black decided to take it with the bishop, therefore he refused to actually accept the sacrifice, which was probably a mistake, because in case black would grab the knight, at least he would have some material advantage, while in the game he took the knight with the bishop, so white could continue his attack with no sacrifices. Now, anyway, let's take a look what would happen if black takes the knight. The one thing black may worried about is what if white keeps destroying the castling position of black by making another sacrifice. Bishop takes h7. Now, the pawn shield around the black's king is destroyed, and white may try to finalize the attack in one of these fairly standard ways to do that, and that rook d3. And at this point it may seem like white is just winning. Rook h3 is coming, checkmate, seems like nothing black can do. Maybe that's the reason why black actually refused to go into this formation. But all of a sudden black had the move bishop e4, which prepares to cover black's king with bishop to h7, which black would do after rook h3, bishop to h7. And notice that not only the bishop covers the king, but it also all of a sudden prepares queen takes c2 checkmate from black. Therefore now white really needs to be careful. Still, white can possibly just continue the game, continue the sacrifices, but it would only give him a draw. White could possibly sacrifice the rook here and then just give perpetual check with the queens, making the checks back and forth on the g and h files, but white only can make a draw here. In the actual game, black played a little bit of a timid move. Bishop takes f6, white recaptured, obviously, and now white continues his attack with no sacrifices. Black played pawn to g6. He is desperately trying to keep all his pawns around his king, but the problem now is that thanks to the white's pawn on f6, white has a very clear idea to just bring his queen sooner or later to h6 and deliver this checkmate on g7. And this pawn on f6 is another common pattern that you may wish to remember. If you just can keep your pawn there, it not only helps white to make this queen maneuver, but also it blocks the black's position, because black can never move his f7 pawn forward, which would possibly give the escape path for the king or would help black to bring up reserves. Therefore, this f6 pawn is somewhat blocking the position, allowing white to bring more pieces to the king side, while at the same time not allowing black to do the same. Therefore, it's a very powerful pawn into the attack if you can make it all the way up to f6. Anyway, let's go next. White pushed the pawn to f5. He's just has this very straightforward attempt to bring the queen to h6 and then to g7. Therefore, it's not really a pawn sacrifice because black can't really capture it anyway. Black instead played queen to d8, taking aim at this pawn, and therefore white just protected it with a queen. Now, black can, of course, take this pawn on f6, possibly, but white can recapture, and notice that due to the pin, black cannot take the bishop now, and therefore this exchange of pawns on f5 rather helps white, because now also black's pawn on d7 is hanging. Therefore, black instead played rook to c8. And here Carlsen continued his attack. He first took on g6, and in this position, can you see what white should do here? It's a relatively simple tactics, and therefore I hope that you could find it. It is the move bishop takes g6. Very standard idea to destroy the pawn shield, and then black can't really grab the bishop because in this case simply queen takes g6, following with queen to g7 checkmate on the next move. Black certainly noticed this variation, and therefore after white took on g6, he recaptured with a queen, queen takes f6. And here comes another critical position of this game. On one hand, it may seem like the white's attack is like somewhat stopped, like what should white do now? Should he just trade off the queens and say that his attack is over? Can you find the winning continuation for white? Can you find something better? It's interesting that in the actual game, Carlsen missed the win, even though he still won the game, but he just didn't play the best move possible. In the game, he played bishop takes h7, which is a very strong move, but he could have played even a stronger move, bishop to f7. Very beautiful tactics. This is a double attack to the black's king from bishop and queen, and therefore the black's king has to move. And if king takes the bishop, white plays rook to f1, which was the idea of the sacrifice of the bishop on the previous move. And now you may notice that the black's queen is lost due to the pin, and therefore white will have the material advantage, and at the same time the black's king is still exposed, therefore on top of that white would be able to continue his attack. In the actual game, Carlsen missed this tactical shot, but what he did, which is bishop takes h7, is also pretty powerful. Let's see what could happen next. Let's say black takes the bishop. In this case, white can grab the pawn on d7, which is a check to the black's king, and at the same time attack on the bishop on b7. And on top of that, if black's king goes back, something like king h8, white certainly could have just traded off the queens and take the bishop, but instead he can play queen h5, king g8, and queen h7 checkmate. Therefore, this is something that black definitely cannot do. We have just seen the sideline. In case black takes the bishop, white would continue with the rook takes d7, and he's winning the game. That's why black played king h8. But white continues chasing the black king. He plays queen h5, preparing some sort of discovered attack against the king, discovered check. Therefore, the king has to try to escape once again. He played king to g7. White continues rook takes d7, winning the pawn. Black plays rook to f7, and here Carlsen played bishop d3. Quite interesting move also. It's not really a sacrifice of the rook because he's ready to play queen h7 and then take the rook back, and it actually happened in the game. Black played first queen f4 check, which doesn't really change much. After that he took the rook, white played queen h7, and then after king f6 he took that rook back on d7 and black just resigned. White is already 2 pawns up. He's threatening the bishop on b7. He's also threatening to play rook to f1. The black's king is exposed, and everything is just so bad for black. It's such a beautiful game where Carlsen managed to totally destroy black's position, and you might have noticed a couple interesting tactical motifs and also attacking patterns. Let's go through them quickly once again. I'd say it all started from here, where Carlsen played bishop to d3, which is the first interesting thing to remember and a useful thing to remember. Develop your bishop to d3, which would help you attack an opponent's castling position. Then, on the next move, he played knight f6, another common theme to destroy the pawn cover of an opponent's king, which he did in his following moves as well. The final thing is that if you can have your pawn on f6, it adds so much power to your attack. And the final thing is, which white did with f5, is to open up the position. You need to open up the position because it opens more lines and diagonals for your pieces so that they can go forward, and also it opens up the position around the opponent's king. And as you can see, white just kept doing this with his following moves. He always tried to open up the position and destroy the pawn cover of the opponent's king. And here, after queen f6, white just took an h7, bishop f7 would have been even stronger, but anyway, brilliant game by Carlsen. Let me know in the comments below if you could find bishop f7, by the way. I'm curious to know, because if you can find the move that Carlsen missed, it's a fairly cool thing. Also, I would actually recommend that you go through this game maybe even a few times, because it's useful to really capture these patterns so that you can really use them in your own games. And therefore also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so that first of all you won't miss out on the new videos that we publish, and also you can get back to this game and keep remembering these useful attacking patterns. Finally, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, and of course, let me know any questions you have in the comments below. I'll make sure to follow up. Thank you guys so much for your attention, and I'll talk to you in the next videos.